everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Andrea and I am a rare book librarian, and in the past on this channel I've made librarianship, manuscript type of videos where I spoke about book history, print culture, or miscellaneous fun facts about books like bookworms and book smells. I have now taken some of those videos down, and I'm going to incorporate those elements in this video and add a lot more to it because I now have something that I didn't have before, which is actual examples and footage that I took myself. So that gives me a lot of freedom to explain things in a lot more detail and show things to you. And this is kind of a crash course video. Almost every single component discussed in this video can be elaborated on for hours and hours. There are whole books, whole courses, entire degrees dedicated to just one element of the things I'm going to talk to you about. So this is kind of for beginners and newbies in kind of the book history world. And if you're interested in rare book librarianship or just the elements of a rare book, stick around. And most of all, I hope you get a really nice visual experience from this video. I mentioned bookworms, so let's return to that one. Yes, bookworms are very much real. Now, what bookworms are, they're not actually worms. They are insects in their larval stage. So the majority of bookworms are mostly beetles. There is a term for it in Latin. Anobium punctatum is kind of like your standard bookworm, but there are lots of other things that can qualify as a bookworm. And I did buy the giant microbe of a bookworm, which looks a lot like this. I pull this out for classes often because I think he's such a cute little guy. And I do collect giant microbes. I have a bunch of STDs and then this guy. So bookworms sometimes live in manuscripts or in the covers of books, and their tracks are usually like little tiny trenches. So on the screen right now you'll see a manuscript that has been eaten by bookworms, and you can identify the look of this particular trench and hole. And what I want you to differentiate it from is from a hole that looks a lot more like this, where it's a perfect circle. If you have a perfect circle like this that's sort of smooth in a manuscript, particularly parchment, it means that when this parchment was made, which was animal skin being scraped and then stretched out, the people didn't notice that the animal previously had been bitten by a flea or had some sort of mole or imperfection in the skin. So when it gets stretched out, it kind of becomes a perfectly smooth hole. And monks in the past have either stitched it up, like you see here, or they even did some patterns or designs inside of the hole, or left it open, just like you saw in the manuscript. There are many different types of stitches, and the stitches don't necessarily mean that it was one of these flea bites. It could also mean that there was a tear in the paper afterwards. Sometimes you can notice the differences based on how the writing goes, because sometimes the writing goes around the stitch, and sometimes the stitch goes through the writing, so then you can know which one came first. Now, the reasons they would go to such lengths is because it was very difficult to obtain paper, right? It took a long time to create parchment, so you wouldn't want to let any of it go to waste. And this is something that will come in handy a little bit later when we discuss fragments. Now, another fun fact is what creates bookish smells. So bookish smells can be divided in kind of four categories. The first is having these rare manuscripts and leather bindings where you pretty much smell decaying flesh, animal skin, lyes and dyes that have been used over the years and their slow degradation over time. There's also the main one, which is the actual rare book smell. So these are rare books between, I don't know, like 1600 to 19th century, where these ones, what you're really smelling is the breaking down of the glues in the spine of the book or things holding this book together. So what you're smelling is the dying of a book. And among these chemicals are a few things, and I'm gonna put most of them on the screen right now. You can pause to read. But some of the extracts, like vanillin, for example, can also be found in vanilla. So you're smelling kind of a latte-ish smell because there's also components found in almonds. So it's no wonder that these old book smells are intoxicating, because the breakdown of the glue contains so many of the natural materials that we really truly love in other spaces. Now, another book smell is the brand new books. So these are books newly printed. Here there's a lot more involved in the terms of production and chemicals involved. Again, I'll put some on the screen, and these kind of have a very like new ink smell. A lot of people love this smell as well. Some of them prefer it to the old book smell. But when you enter a library, you kind of get a whiff of all of these things combined. The new books, the rare books, some even have rare books and manuscripts or all the way back. And if it's a circulating library, you will also have books that have absorbed the smells around them. Some people smoke tobacco and it smells and the book absorbs that smell, and they have it in their house for a while and then donate it. So you never really know. That's why sometimes you can tell the difference between a secondhand bookshop and a public library versus a rare book library. The smells are all very different. What's really fun to see is that when they make those scented candles on Etsy or artist shops, if you look at the ingredients for those candles labeled old book smell, vanilla is almost always a component. Let's talk a little bit about foxing. Now, foxing is a very complex topic, and I've made a very long video on this. That's one of my longer videos, and I'm going to link it somewhere because it goes pretty deep. But basically, foxing is the result of imperfections in the paper, especially showing up more in paper that was printed during the great mechanization of paper production. So you are more likely to see foxing in Victorian books than you are to see it in books from the 1500s. And another component is part of the metal type that was used to print these books. The type itself has metal components that interact with the paper, and their residue can create some of the foxing. There's also a theory that there might be an abiotic material versus biotic. There's also environmental factors, the fluctuation of temperature in the room. There are also anomalies, which I mentioned in that longer video, such as the portrait of himself by Leonardo da Vinci, or an old man, where you have old good quality paper that wasn't made in a post-mechanized world, and you have chalk. So why is there so much foxing on this? There's a lot of debate going on, and there are different types of foxing as well, where you have kind of a snowflake one versus a bullseye one. Conservators have written many papers, so I'll link you to that video if you want to know more. But ultimately, foxing is the result of imperfections that already existed in the book before you got it, with a limited assistance by the actual environment, but sometimes that can contribute greatly to it. Let's talk manuscripts, because I mentioned them a little bit when we talked about bookworms. Manuscripts are my favorite topic in rare book lore. First, let's establish what is a manuscript, because manuscript is often used in conversation to refer mainly to medieval manuscripts, because that's kind of the beautiful illuminated ones, and we visualize the scribes working on these manuscripts. But manu means hand, and a manuscript can be someone writing in their diary. It could be a commonplace book. For example, this commonplace book is from a later time than the medieval period, but there's handwriting in it, so that counts as a manuscript as well. Another thing that can count as a half manuscript, I guess, or a full-on manuscript is marginalia. In medieval manuscripts used to have glossing already embedded in the initial manuscript, so it was kind of like an annotation by a different monk or a different scholar, and then later on people would add on their own marginalia. But marginalia is technically done by hand, so that could be a component that makes up a manuscript. But generally speaking, when we talk manuscripts, we usually say medieval manuscripts or ancient so-and-so manuscripts or 18th century manuscripts. That's why you usually have a qualifier so that it specifies what we're talking about. For example, some of my favorite things in our collections are legal documents and land deeds, and these even have the seal on them, which contains a lot of poisonous materials. And there are also inks that are very poisonous, and we can get into inks in a whole other video in the future. There are different cultures that tackle manuscripts in different ways. So for example, Ethiopian manuscript culture persisted well into the 20th century, and they still wrote on parchment in the 20th century. So there's an array of things you can study if you're interested in manuscripts. But fragments come from a combination of things. So first of all, when the printing press or movable type was created by Gutenberg and more people were drawn to print now, they printed on laid paper, and they wanted to make use of these scraps of manuscripts that they had lying around from before. People had respect for all of the materials and they didn't want to let it go to waste. So a lot of these medieval manuscripts that were commonly available, maybe they were legal books for students, maybe they were something biblical or something like that. If they had a manuscript around that they no longer needed, they would sometimes chop it up and use it to reinforce the binding of the printed book. So now you would have these medieval manuscripts either used as end papers, you might have them be used like little fragments in the spine of a book to keep it all together, but you might also have them padding the binding of the book itself, like the covers, which makes it very difficult to look at now without breaking the entire book. The second way we come across manuscript fragments is via biblioclasts. There was a group of people in the 20th century called biblioclasts who basically had access to medieval manuscripts, and they figured out that if you split them up and rip them apart and sell them for parts, you might make more money. So they did this to a lot of medieval manuscripts. There are some more famous than others who distributed all kinds of boxes around the world featuring many different manuscripts. I have one in our collection, and it's got manuscripts from the 1200s to the 1600s. Now, there are some pros to this. I know it sounds very negative, but the pros are that if you are a student interested in manuscripts and you don't have access to all of them because they're very unique and rare and hard to find, having a box featuring samples of manuscripts from all around the world from different centuries could be beneficial for learning and seeing it with your own eyes and seeing a sample of each. It's really useful for teaching. So I find it very useful to have this one box in our collection when I teach classes, because I get to show students, hey, like this is what a medieval manuscript looked like in 1250 in France versus this illuminated leaf from Belgium later on. We get to see what traveled, what was communicated between different countries, and it's beautiful to look at and compare. And the other beautiful thing is that it kind of created this whole new field called fragmentology. So now there are scholars who just collect all kinds of fragments from around the world and they study them, they try to put them back together like a puzzle. My favorite thing that's happened recently is there's now people who go around with machinery that's like got UV and infrared lighting, and they kind of do ultrasounds basically on books. So they'll kind of scan the covers and try to see if there are manuscript fragments inside of the pages. And sometimes they find really cool things. So I've asked the person who was visiting what's the coolest thing she's found this way. And she said that there was a monastery that was very Christian, and it had this wall of medieval manuscripts, and they were all religious texts. And they found this room that was forgotten and boarded up, and they found even more manuscripts there. And as they went through them and did the infrared scanning, they found out that one of these manuscripts was a palimpsest. So a palimpsest means that something was written on this manuscript and then it was kind of scraped off and writing was added on top of it. So then now we see the new writing and the old writing is forgotten. But with this new technology, we get to see the writing underneath. And they found in a medieval religious manuscript that underneath was an ancient Greek or Roman text that they had not encountered elsewhere. So it kind of provided a new classical text. In our own library, we found out that one of these manuscript fragments that had all this residual glue on the back, and we just kept it in a folder. Turns out it's actually a royal letter from King Louis XI of France. So finding things like this is fascinating, and I'm really happy that fragmentology as a field exists. There are databases around the world that collect and digitize these medieval manuscript fragments. I'm going to link a few of these things down below if you want to poke around. It's really a lot of fun. But I really wanted to answer this in more detail because a few videos ago when I showed some of these fragments hiding in the books, I was asked, you know, where do these manuscripts come from? Why are they there? Like, how does this come about? So I guess it's a long story. Let's talk incunables. What is an incunable? So the term incune comes from Latin, meaning cradle, or cradle books, baby books. And this is early printed books. And when I say early, I mean the first 50 years after movable type was created. When they transitioned to the printing press, they really tried to imitate the manuscript look. They wanted to have the same layout, but to do it by machine, right? So the first 50 years are pretty interesting because you have this imitation process while at the same time trying to tinker with new technology. And it's done on really good quality paper. So surprisingly, there's no foxing as you would find in a Victorian book. Incunables are fascinating and they are very rare because, you know, they're from the infancy of printed text. So that's what incunables are, and they're fascinating. I only have leaves. We do have a few full books, and we'll bring it all together at the end. So I just wanted to touch on incunables ever so briefly. Now, paper and binding is a complex study because there are entire classes on this. But I wanted to show you some jars of stuff. This is what the actual term is for what you see down here. So this pulpy material is the broken down pulp that then results in paper. Paper making involves a lot of water if you're going to do it from scratch and make your own. We have laid paper, which has the chain lines, and that's where you often see watermarks. I kid you not, there are entire volumes and shelves of books written about just watermarks and the history of watermarks. And there are people who study these very closely. Some printing houses in the past have their own watermark. They are phenomenal to look at. So paper production has a long history. Japanese paper looks very different and has a different production history. Then there's the end pages or marbled paper. And marbled paper also has a very elaborate history, and they're very unique because you have to make it from scratch each time. In the past, they used to have kind of catalogs featuring all kinds of papers and their materials, and you'd see, you know, what you want for your book or for your newspaper, and you would get to select it the same way people do now for wedding invitations. Now, when it comes to binding, again, entire classes exist on this, and you could spend hours and hours just binding a single book in one form or another. So there's paper binding, there's cloth binding. If you see white leather, this usually means pigskin, and it ages very tough. There's leather binding from Victorian books, like you see here. There are all kinds of binding, and materials affect the way the book survives over time, right? There's also this thing called Mochlin binding, which is the newest term to me. I'm going to upload a video very soon just about Mochlin binding. There is also paper mache binding, where the covers have this 3D component to them and you can feel them, and it's a very cool tactile experience. There are many components to a historical book, like goffered edges, like you see here, with this impression on the margins and the gilding. And in the past, we've seen four-edge paintings, which is a whole other realm of artistry. It's beautiful to look at. And in the past, rich people would prefer to have their entire library match. So they wanted to have their own personal bookbinder, bind all of their books in one singular color. So they say, oh, my collection's all red books, or green binding. One of the things I have in my collection is this fourth printing of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. But as you can see, they're just in quires, which usually means a gathering of a few leaves. And this would be sold like this in parts to people because they would want to take it home and give it to their own binder. People had books for different reasons, for portability reasons. There's a lot in here to discuss. And I guess this kind of brings me to bookish formats. One of my favorite fun facts is that books don't necessarily just exist in this codex format where you have two covers and a double-sided leaf inside, right? You have books from all around the world looking very different. For example, one of the ones we have in our collection is from Bali, and it's a pothi, which is Sanskrit for book. This is done on banana leaf, and you have it in Sanskrit here. And as you can see, there's this string that keeps it all together, so you would open it similar to the way you would blinds for windows. And you have the wooden boards on the edges. So it's really fascinating to see how different formats look. And then over time, people experimented with books. A lot of bookbinders and printers like to make little projects. They have challenges. There are whole competitions yearly where people show up to book fairs with different 3D projects. Maybe it's a woodcut, maybe it's a pop-up kind of book that shows different things, right? One of my favorite things to see is the miniature books that people make, because sometimes they do it as a project to test it out before they commit to a bigger project so they can test out the binding. In my hand here, you see the smallest book in my collection. Believe it or not, this is not the smallest book in existence. There are small books with writing in them that you need a microscope to look at them. At this moment, seeing where the book arts and book history combine and all of the creative possibilities that exist in book production is such a fascinating thing to see. There are YouTube channels. There are people who are just focused on one teeny tiny component of a book, like ink, for example, and ink production, and where each individual pigment would have been sourced at a specific time in history. And books have a very, very rich history in production. I guess I'm going to end on two things. So the first is a question that I get pretty often, and this is, should you wear gloves at a rare book library? Because sometimes they give you gloves and sometimes you can request them. And the answer is actually no. A lot of books require you to handle them with care with your hands. You need that dexterity and you need to be able to touch it. It's better for the book, and it's so you don't fumble. A lot of people drop things and ruin unique artifacts forever because of mishandling. But some things like manuscripts require the oil from your hands. It's actually better for them to do well. Gloves are sometimes required for photographs or for unique things like microfiche or some historical things that just have a different texture. And in this case, the librarian will tell you where you are if you need them or not. But for the general rare book or manuscript, you don't need gloves. So now let's bring this all together. I showed this book a few videos ago, but if we were to look at it knowing what we know now, we see this incunable book bound in leather in 1488 with metal furniture. That's what these little feet and the metallic decorations are called, and metallic clasps. Inside we have laid paper, and it's an incunable. It was printed on a printing press, and it's made to look like a manuscript, though it's done by machine technically. And we have all this beautiful script. And then on the end pages, the boards have manuscript, that's medieval manuscript on it. And over here we have the little trenches dug out by the bookworms. And overall it smells pretty good. So yeah, see, it all came together as it usually does. If you have any more bookish questions, please ask them. Maybe I'll make a follow-up video, and I'd love to share more of this world with you. So thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in a future video very soon. Bye!